welcome to the latest instalment of the Ace Records podcast with myself, Pete Perfides. It's hard to think of a band whose influence has been quite as inversely proportionate to their British chart positions as the Zombies, a band adored by Jimi Hendrix, the Beatles, Paul Weller, Tom Petty and Dusty Springfield, who even asked them to write a song for her. In America, though, it was a different story. Their career there was bookended by the number one success of She's Not There, and then, at the very end, Time of the Season, the latter of which made its ascent to the top spot after the band had gone their separate ways. Odessey and Oracle, of course, is a record which, in the 5 decades since its release, has become one of those albums to be pulled out along with Sgt Pepper, Pet Sounds and the Bee Gees first when your children ask you what the 60s were supposed to be like. As with the Beatles, whose influence they were so upfront about, the Zombies benefited from the presence of 2 master songwriters in their ranks. Perhaps the better known of those 2 was keyboard maestro Rod Argent, but for those of us who get off on looking at songwriting credits and making unsubstantiated generalisations from them, there's something about a Chris White songwriting credit that serves as a kite mark of a very particular sort of excellence. I'm talking about the elegant vulnerability at the heart of songs such as I Can't Make My Mind Up, What More Can I Do, I Love You and I Don't Want to Know, and then later on his sublime contributions to Odessey and Oracle, Maybe After He's Gone, Brief Candles and Friends of Mine being exceptional cases in point. But then really you can drop the needle on almost any Zombies record and feel that Tom Petty had a point when in his 1997 intro to the group's definitive anthology Zombie Heaven he wrote, "If a group like the Zombies appeared now, they would own the world. So with all this in mind, it's an absolute privilege to say hello to the one and only Chris White." Hi Chris.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm excellent, thank you.
Good. We've met once before, but there's absolutely no earthly reason why you should remember it. Shall I tell you where it was?
Yes.
It was on the 5th floor bar at the St George's Hotel, and along with the rest of the Zombies, and also happening that day was a memorial get-together in honour of the TV-themed titan Ronnie Hazelhurst.
Where was that?
Well, it was on Regent Street. It was, the very tall hotel, St George's Hotel, next to BBC Centre.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And I think you were probably doing interviews with quite a few people that day in advance of the Shepherd's Bush concert.
Yes, of course. I remember, yes.
And it was very it was a lovely. It was lovely to spend an hour collectively in your company, actually, because after all these years, you were still very visibly comfortable in each other's presence.
That's the one best thing. I think we only just got this award recently because we're still 4 or 5 of us are still alive. And we still like each other, which is a rarity for a 60s band, to be quite honest.
It is, yes. So are we talking about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame?
Yes.
Has that now actually happened?
Yes, we went and played to 14,000 people, and it was absolutely fantastic. And Susanna Hoffs gave an incredible introduction to us, and it was just a wonderful occasion. It was like justification after all that time. And we did 4 songs on stage.
What did you do? I mean, I can probably guess 2, but what were the other
they
2?
wanted us to do She's Not There, Tell Her No. Then they did This Will Be Our Year, which they cut out on the broadcast, and Time of the Season.
Wow, incredible.
It was fantastic.
This Will Be Our Year is one of those songs which just, I guess as you get older, just kind of...
It's become a wedding song now.
Has it literally become a wedding song?
It has. I've played it at 3 weddings, and 2 of my sons as well, yeah.
Do people write to you and say, can you do this song at our wedding?
No, but met Graham Nash.
Graham Nash.
And met his girlfriend when we went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and his wife wants This Will Be Our Year to be played at her wedding to him.
That's amazing though, isn't it?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. It's funny feeling. It's weird feeling.
It's a very unusual song. Obviously we'll come back to Odessey and Oracle in the fullness of time. But it's a very unusual song for that time in that setting because there is a side to it. It's just unabashed, good-natured, good vibes.
Hope, yes.
Yeah. You were very good. I guess that's kind of a piece on that album with Friends of Mine.
Yes, I remember writing. I was sharing a flat with Rod at the time, and I had some friends round, and I played it very slowly on guitar. And then when we were doing stuff at Odyssey and Oracle, Rod said, "Why don't we speed it up?" And then we need something at the chorus. Why don't we put all the names of people we know? Most of which have got divorced since then. And
So it's like a requiem.
yes, it is. Yes, really. But it was a pleasurable thing at the time, you know.
It's lovely. So is there does that slow version exist anywhere on a tape somewhere?
No, I never did it on tape. I was just playing it to somebody in my room, basically.
That sounds like a nice thing. So you're, I guess, obviously you were the bassist, and that was something you got from your father, wasn't it?
Yes, my father played double bass. He was a shopkeeper. Originally worked on London Transport as an inspector years ago.
Do you remember seeing him in his inspector role?
No, never in his inspector role, because I was 5 when we moved out to Hertfordshire, and then he played double bass in big bands and things, because my family's quite musical as well. So then I started playing double bass.
I guess at that point all bassists were double bassists, weren't they?
Yes. It was only when we saw the Shadows and other. Yes, it was the Shadows, and several tours when saying that a fabulous bass. You don't have to carry this thing around. My father did teach me to have my double bass in a Mini.
How can you get a double bass?
You go in the front, then over the back, and then the back is there, and then you have the neck up by the passenger side. It's not easy. And then I do remember as a kid he had the double bass on the back of his car. He had a fitment where he used to carry it on the back of his car. Yeah.
What, literally like on top of the car?
No, on the back, where the spare wheels sometimes go.
Oh, I see. Really?
Yeah.
Well, I guess you had to be ingenious.
Yes, and be careful of traffic.
But that's interesting that that you should have had a specific memory of your father. The Mini and the double bass. That's kind of like a lovely little snapshot in a way.
Oh, very much so. Yes, my dad was a great fellow. Now his younger brother played in the Billy Turner big band and was the arranger, and then he became an arranger for the BBC and did all the arrangements there.
Right.
And he just died a couple of weeks ago. He got to 100.
Wow. And wasn't he the chap who took you to see Oh Boy being recorded?
That's right, yes.
Okay.
Fantastic. Jack Good programme, and that was really exciting. Yeah.
I can imagine. So that would have been, 1958 or something?
It must have been.
To see, I mean, I guess not that many people would have had televisions anyway, to actually see a TV programme being made.
And the big shock for me going to see it, because I'd seen it on television, was it's in colour. The curtains were red, and on television, because they're black. Yeah.
Yeah. Of course. I mean, even in my mind's eye, I'm imagining you walking into black and white world.
Yes, it was quite shocking, because I said, "Oh, it's in colour."
Who was on that week?
Cliff Richard, Vince Eager, of course, Lord Rockingham's 11.
Was that the famous, not Cliff Richard doing Move It, surely?
No, it was after that. Because he did other songs. And then
yeah.
Seeing the band live as well, Lord Rockingham's 11, which was very exciting. So
what, doing Hootsmon?
Yes, is a moose loose about the hoose, yeah.
Okay, and that was a guy who went on to famously arrange Riverman by Nick Drake, I think.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, is it Harry Robinson?
Yes, that's right, yeah. I remember that name, yes. And of course, I didn't see him then, but Duffy Power was part of the same stable, Larry Parnes thing.
Yeah.
Rod and I did an album with him many years later, which was never released.
Really?
Yes, we've still got it, yes.
To this day, never released?
Yes.
Well, that needs to surely be remedied.
Such a great singer, Duffy Power. Really was fantastic.
How can this album come out? Surely this album needs to come out.
It is coming out with the project that I was telling you about earlier.
What, is it coming out on Ace?
Well, no, we're putting it ourselves, distributed by Ace, probably.
Very good. Amazing. Wow. Okay, and so that's interesting. You mentioned the sort of people like Duffy Power, and people kind of coming through this stable of talent, which is sort of nurtured by Larry Parnes. And I'm thinking, well, here are the nascent zombies out in St Albans, still at grammar school, yeah?
No, I was at art college. I was studying fine arts.
Okay.
I was going to be a teacher until we won the contest in '64.
Okay, yeah. So, okay, we'll come to that, because
Okay.
that's... But were you were you the others were the others a different school to you?
Colin, myself, and the original bass player went to St Albans Grammar School, the county grammar school.
Right.
Rod, Hugh, and Paul were at what's it was called? The Abbey School. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I thought what I'm getting at really, I guess, is to sort of St Albans must have seemed. St Albans is not far away from London, but I'm guessing that maybe it must have felt far away from London to you, watching this kind of all these events happening so sort of quickly in the West End of London, and people kind of being vaulted from certain cafes in Soho onto programs like Oh Boy and up the pop charts.
It was exciting, but I was asked to join the Zombies about 8 months after they started. Or it might have been longer, because their original bass player wanted to concentrate on his A levels, and I knew the manager of the band, who was in school with me at St Albans Grammar School, and so I just went along, and then we clicked, and we started doing 3-part harmonies. And
you were already friends with Rod at this point, though, weren't you?
No.
Were you not?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, okay.
No.
So how did you? There was I read somewhere, because didn't you sort of knock on his door or something?
Yes, I wasn't friends with them. I said I was playing to make money as a student. I was doing dance band stuff and dances and things, and we were short of a keyboard player, and I knocked on his door, and he wasn't interested. His dad was in a dance band, but he wasn't interested. Hasn't changed much. Was
he polite? I'm imagining you knocking on his door, and that must have taken some guts, really, to knock on someone's.
Not really, because I was introduced by a friend of his, the original bass player.
Right. Okay.
So I knocked on his door. I said, "Would you be interested?" "Not really." So.
And back at your core, I guess, at that point, I guess you saw yourselves as an R&B group primarily?
That's what we were called, yes. I joined when they had decided to call themselves the Zombies, because they tried all the other names and found there were groups with that name already. So, anyway, I like the name Zombies. It's like the Beatles, a name is then identified with the group instead of, being the undead.
Totally, yeah, absolutely. It's a good name. It's still a good name now. And you, so I guess you, you rehearsed in Hatfield.
Yes. At the, I've forgotten the name of the place. Was the Church Hall, and there's I forgot what the name is now. Yeah.
Can you picture it in your head?
Oh yes. Because actually, a few years back, a Dutch TV crew made a film about us about the album. And Hugh Grundy, the drummer, took them up to show it where it used to be. It was so much smaller than, when you see it later. So I remembered it from that TV programme more than anything else.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's funny how, pictures in magazines and TV programmes can often sort of superimpose themselves over actual sort of memories.
Yes.
And you see, actually, with groups remembering their own history, often, especially if you're interviewing superstars, they'll sort of almost tell you a version of their own history that you recognise from a television programme rather than the books that you've read. Yes. But you did see yourselves very much as an R&B group.
Yes.
You kind of got.
We did covers, basically.
And I got the sense that you attracted a sort of slightly left field crowd as a result of that.
I don't know if they were left field. They were a lot younger.
Right, okay.
And actually then we played in rugby clubs and things, because the school had a rugby club. And so we built that up. We played intervals, first of all.
Intervals?
Yeah, between artists and comedians and things.
And you had, I guess, and in that, I guess the earlier you early on, like so many, like the Beatles or anyone really, you had to have a good repertoire of covers to really please people.
Yes.
What were the songs you liked playing the most?
Are you asking me now? Over 55 years later.
Usually musicians can remember those things a lot more clearer than they can remember.
Some Beatles songs.
Yeah.
Some Searchers songs. Drifters, and it's an R&B thing. I can't remember many of the R&B things.
No,
it's quite interesting that we did the art school dance, several times, because we were at St Albans Art School. I then did some stuff with Pete Brown, who wrote the lyrics for Cream.
Right, okay.
And I was involved doing stuff with him, and basically he wanted an album called The Art School Dance Goes On Forever. So he went to Primrose Hill and he invited all the musicians who came from art school. There were too many of them. They couldn't take the photograph. So many musicians in the 60s came from art school.
Why do you think that is?
Art school offered an opportunity, and we had grants in those days, so you didn't have to take loans out, to explore creativity. And it was an explosive time for art. And then, because art is equated with music, it's about patterns and different ideas. So a lot of, I mean, even Lennon was as well. So, they were all at art school.
What were your areas of speciality? What were you, presumably...
No, I'll tell you what, we went to a fine arts where they taught you to grind oil paint and prime canvases and things. It wasn't graphic design or anything like that. It was useless in a way because it was 4 years, and all they were doing was training you to be a teacher.
Oh, really?
I was going to be an art teacher.
Did you, all along, did you feel that that's what you were there for, that if you could, at the end of this, if you could be an art teacher, that was probably not a bad outcome?
At that time, yes, yeah. But okay. I liked... Recently I saw Tim Minchin when he did his graduation thing, and he said, don't have long-term goals, have short-term goals. Yeah. It's easier.
That's not a bad idea generally, I think, in life, because otherwise you lose sight of what's really important.
Or you get disappointed when you get your goal and then there's nothing else to do.
Absolutely. So I guess a lot of things really sort of significantly changed for you guys when you entered this Heartsbeat competition at Watford Town Hall.
Well, we were going to split up because I'm 2 years older than the rest of the band. And basically they were going to go to college or something like that. I was going to do another year of teacher training after the 4 years there. So we entered the contest as a last farewell. And it went over several weeks. And we won our heat. And then we won the actual contest. And we thought, what are we going to do now? Let's try it out for 6 months.
But it came in the nick of time. I mean, I get the impression, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I get the impression that certainly your father seemed like a more liberal presence in your life.
All he said was he said, look, when first I went to art school, he said, you're going to have your friends buy motorbikes and things like that, and you won't be able to afford it. Are you sure that's okay? And when I went to music, he said, just do it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That's
very
so
supportive.
Brilliant.
And actually, he used to, as he had a shop, we used to buy amplifiers, and he used to buy them, and we used to do like every time a gig, we paid him off, you see. So he was very useful like that.
So what did his shop sell?
Well, it was a general store in the village. And then he started selling furniture and painting things and everything like that. So,
wow,
very supportive man.
Really exceptional. Presumably more supportive than maybe the rest of the band's parents.
There were a couple of parents who thought it was. I mean, I remember Paul Atkinson, who's sadly gone a few years back. Yeah. We came back from the first American tour we did. Was what's his name? Dick Clark show. That's right. And he came in exhausted on a night flight and came home and really tired. And then he sat down, and then his brother, who was training in the city to be an accountant, came in, and so his mother said, "Oh, Paul, he's had a hard day at work. Can you go out and get the coal from the shed?"
Oh my word!
And that was the way he was treated. It wasn't a job.
Yeah,
it wasn't work.
Yeah, but of course, as we all know, the kind of the travel, and certainly in those days, bands really did have to work.
Oh, yeah.
2 sets a night, and the travel alone, and the promotion, and all the rest of
it.
So that kind of, you won that competition really in the nick of time. Maybe not so much for you because obviously you had more supportive family, but it did allow the rest of the band to sort of defer their sort of educational plans, didn't it?
Yes, it did. There were supportive parents. They'd signed the contract because when we originally signed contracts to get a publishing deal, they were underage then.
Right. Okay.
I was the only one who didn't have to have my father sign. Like, I was 21.
Did you feel that? I remember, seeing an interview with the Beatles being interviewed for the anthology set in the early 90s, and there was just a sort of George saying something like, Paul was 18 months older than me then, and he's still 18 months older than me now. So meaning that seniority, that sort of, it never quite goes.
Well, it didn't matter for us so much because the leader was Rod. I mean, he was the leader, and you got a voice like Collins.
Yeah.
There was no hierarchy.
Right. Okay.
We each had, if we wrote songs, we had to prove it to the others. It wasn't done unless they all agreed, and we rehearsed it.
So you had to really give it your best shot when you're playing them for the first time.
Oh yes, yeah.
Wow, sounds kind of nerve-wracking.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Especially like with, I guess, because I get the impression because Rod had so many more songwriting credits.
Well, no, actually, Rod didn't have many songwriting credits because when we got the first deal, through my uncle introducing us to Ken Jones, the first producer, he said, well, we're going to the studios, perhaps you could try writing something.
Mm.
So Rod wrote She's Not There then, and I wrote the B-side. There was nothing before that.
I just thought was that not the case? Because certainly on the first album and the kind of the sides, the kind of singles that were released in the wake of the first album, I thought there were slightly more Rod credits than yours, but maybe not.
No, there were a lot more of Rod's, but basically She's Not There was only the second song he ever wrote.
The second he ever wrote.
Yes.
Wow. I was just re-listening to a lot of songs, in advance of sort of coming here, and I still notice something new in She's Not There every time I hear it.
Yes, the structure was totally different. We always tried to be not what was expected.
Yeah, and the harmonies, especially to this morning, it struck me that the harmonies are more like a sort of modal folk song than.
Yes, because Rod was in the St Albans Abbey Choir.
Ah.
So his consciousness about harmonies was from a different area of music.
That's interesting, because they're almost like medieval harmonies,
yes,
really.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that kind of you even if you don't notice it, at an emotional level, you feel that difference. It's not outside of the norm of pop music.
That's right. Pat Metheny once said to Rod, he said, I love the modal structure. And Rod said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then he went back and analysed his chords and read up about it, realised he'd instinctively done modal structures and the chords at the beginning.
I think if you isolated the vocals, in a way, it'd be more obvious that's kind of.
That's true. We had influences from classical music because I used to go to classical concerts and jazz, of course, modern jazz.
And Dick Rowe, these days, Dick Rowe, I guess, is famous, and unfairly so, really, as the guy who turned down the Beatles because, of course, he signed so many other groups, including yourselves. And he sort of offered you a deal. He offered you a contract there and then, didn't he?
Yes, he did, but that's where my uncle came in because we had all these offers after we won, and we said there were no music business lawyers around then. So my dad said, "Go and see your Uncle Ted because he's in the music business." And we went to see Uncle Ted. He said, "Well, I don't know anything about pop music."
What was his area of expertise?
So he played all saxophones and arranged for the big bands, and then arranged for the BBC. That's right. So anyway, he said, go and see Ken Jones because he'd produced records and he's another. He played with big bands. So I went along to see Ken Jones with his contracts just to see what was good and what was bad in them. So he went through them and said, that's a bad clause. That's a good clause. That's terrible. And when we said afterwards, well, what can you offer us? He said, well, I'll give you all the best clauses. Oh. So our first deal, then he signed us with Dick Rowe on a release tape deal.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay.
So we got the best advice right at the beginning.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's invaluable.
It is.
And
that's why I still earn money from my royalties.
Really?
Yes.
That's
a very rare thing.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. And so you were touring a lot. I mean, the great thing about this Zombie Heaven box set, amongst many other things, is you get this. You get a sort of your tour itinerary from year to year, and you really get to see how a sort of picture of how you must have been evolving just as a live entity as much as anything.
That's what you learn your chops, as John Verity used to say, is basically you have to go out and keep playing to audiences as small as 10.
Right, yes, of course. And then you get to see yourself as other people see you in a way, and so especially if you're playing with other bands. So I'm thinking about towards the end of 1964, which was an incredible time for you, really, because that's when She's Not There sort of scaled the American charts. And you toured over here with the Isley Brothers, didn't you?
Oh, fantastic. They were great fun, and you learned so much from them. And Hugh, the drummer, learned a lot more from their drummer as well. And then the drummer said, no, I like what you're playing anyway. So learning all those things, and from Dusty Springfield and Dionne Warwick and touring with all those people, you know.
What kind? How did you seem to those people? That's kind of, I'm really interested in that, how you would seem to the Isley Brothers.
Unusual. They loved what we were doing, but it was totally different from what they were doing. But you use it's entertainment. You have to please the audience, and it was fun watching them. And they had, mind you, they had the Alan Elston band, the jazz band, supporting them, and so did Dionne Warwick. You know, so
right.
So it was slightly out of. They didn't have the big American musicians.
Yeah.
When we went to America 6 months later, to the Murray the K's Christmas show in '64, we played like Benny King, the Shirelles, the Shangri-Las, the Drifters, and it was. We were really worried because were we going to stand up to their level? But they were so helpful, so friendly, and they just. And when we later did the Dick Clark tour, we arrived late, and there was about 15 black acts on this thing, and then at night we travelled through the night. We stayed on the bus every other night and had a hotel, and they started singing gospel and blues songs and everything. And then they suddenly say, "You Limeys, you sing something." So Rod and Colin started singing a Beatles song, and they were totally knocked out and accepted us from that point onwards.
Wow. Well, that's it's a lot of those Motown groups, when they came over here, and you saw it later on with the Stax singers as well. They were completely unprepared for the reception that they got over here, because it was a lot less blinkered in a way, the reception they got over here, and they weren't playing to segregated audiences and so forth. So it was like it was almost like a glimpse into an idealized future, wasn't it?
Exactly. And in the 40s and 50s, the black American jazz players went to Paris because their acceptance there was, they weren't used to it. When we toured in the southern states with all these black acts on the Dick Clark tour, it was frightening. You got refused service. And it was, we weren't used to that.
No.
Because musicians and people are people. It's simple as that.
And you're so young as well. It's kind of almost like a frightening thing to be a participant in. And
you don't understand the hatred.
Yeah.
We don't know where it came from. You know?
And would you talk about that with the musicians?
Oh, yes.
The black music. What would that? What can you remember what they would say?
Well, they said you get used to it. And they accepted us because we had English accents. If we were American, their acceptance would be different.
And they must have seen how appalled you were at some of the practices that you were.
Well,
witnessing.
Colin was actually at the time going out with the lead singer of the Velvets.
I didn't know that.
And on the tour anyway. So we had one of those stops on the road at night, and he walked around with his arm around her, and then the tour manager came, "We've got to leave. They're going to get shot." It was in the southern states.
Oh my
And he had his arm around a black girl.
That's unbelievable.
And then one other time, we had a lot of rednecks come up, and they started shouting from their truck, and but they're really abusing all the coloured acts, the black acts, and basically then this college coach came up with rugby football players, and they were appalled as well. They turned the rednecks van over on its side. So we thought, that was the good side of the Americans.
Yeah.
They didn't accept it either.
That's amazing. And the I read a quote somewhere that it rather tickled me, actually. A conversation that you were apparently having with the Isley Brothers, where you were talking about how you and Rod were both Miles Davis fans.
Yes.
And the Isleys were a little bit thrown.
They said, "Starvation music, man."
I love this. It's never quite as you would expect. So I mean, you were kind of thrust into this incredible situation.
It's like a magic land, really.
2 days. You missed Christmas Day in 1964 because you spent Christmas in America for the first.
Yes, we were doing. I think it was 6. Rod says 8 shows a day, but you only did 1 or 2 numbers because it was. And then the audience came in at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they could stay for that. Once you got in, you could stay in. And in between the gigs, there was a film. And then we did, 6 to 8 shows a day.
Oh, there's this thing that I've seen Rod allude to on occasion in interviews, that apparently they were just constantly after your hair, like the kind of really obsessive fans.
We weren't used to this. Don't forget, it's only 6 since we'd become professional. And we go out the street, and then Paul we used to go outside, and they find him cornered by little girls trying to cut bits of his clothes off and things like that. And the police rescued him, and they said, "We'll do it this once, but you never go out again." So we had to stay inside. So we got to know all the artists in the different dressing rooms. It was like a prison, really.
And it just seems weird to me that, you know, they would actually, it's not like an impetuous scene. These fans would leave the house with scissors, presumably knowing that they were after clothes and hair of their heroes.
It's funny, we're on the tour with the Shangri-Las, where we were running to the bus after a gig. Hugh was a little bit late. He got pulled by his hair backwards. No, he's lost his hair since then. But he got pulled backwards. And then Fat Frankie, the roadie for the Shangri-Las, picked him up and carried him to the bus because he had bits cut off him, you know, clothes and things.
I mean, it sounds terrifying.
Yeah, but you just know you have to be careful because it's enthusiasm.
Yeah.
But it's hearing people scream. They really get hyper active, you know.
Yeah. And by this time, you were managed by a kind of quite a big, larger-than-life character.
Tito Burns.
Tito Burns, who I guess most people remember because he was in that famous scene in Don't Look Back, trying to play off different... Was it TV shows or Agents Against
Agents? No, it was Dylan's coming over. And
that's right,
yes.
Is that pretty much what he was like?
He was old school. And I can tell you a story why we stopped being with him, basically. Was we didn't have any work over here. Rod and I were earning some money from songwriting, but the others was just gig money.
Right.
Paul Atkinson was getting married. So we said we got to get some gigs. So we went to Tito, and he said, "I've got a couple of gigs, 10 days for you in Manila."
Yes. Wow. Yes.
And we said, "How much?" And he said, £100 a night. So we each said no between you. And so he took 25%. So we were earning £18 each night, and we thought we'd be playing in a hotel foyer, you know, a small gig. They said they'll pay for all your accommodation, your food, and your transport and everything. When we arrived there at 3 o'clock in the morning, thousands of kids met us, and we didn't realise we had 3 records in the top 20 there.
Yeah.
Because it's before the internet.
Because you arrived at something like, was it 3 a.m. or something?
That's right, yeah, 3 o'clock in the morning. And when they drew up where we were staying, was where we were playing, which was the second biggest Astrodome in the world next to Houston Astrodome. And we played to 30,000 people a night for 10 days for £18 each.
Did you realize the moment you got there? Did it feel like a fit up?
Not at that point. We were very trusting.
Yeah.
And basically, we had a Chinese bank owner who was an enthusiastic vinyl. He represented Decca, and he took us out with his family for a meal and said, basically, "I think you are being done." We said screwed, but basically, we said, "Well, what we can do?" And he said, "Well, you got a 10-day option for extension. Go back and ask for £1,000 a night." And we said, "Well, what if they don't take it up?" He said, "Well, I've put a consortium together. The mayor of Manila is godfather to my son.
Yeah.
And as a group of people will take you." And so it turned out that he did turn us down, and he did. Then the consortium got together.
Yeah.
But then we were threatened, and basically the first club we played at burnt down the next morning.
Oh my word!
And the second club we played, they said we weren't doing the tune-up, and he said, "Well, I can't put you on. I'm being threatened."
Did you got your passports back? Because when your passports,
I had to go to we had to pretend to go to the airport because we had to leave and get new visas.
Yeah.
And they got our passports, and me being the oldest, I had to pick them up and hold them. Would you tell Mr. Aranita that we're going to stay? And these 2 big Filipino guards and the management representative said, "Mr. Aranita, not gonna like this." So we leapt over the counter, and we stayed at another hotel.
Oh my word!
It was frightening.
It sounds right, because of course the Beatles had been through something similar, hadn't they?
Yes, a few, and we kept being asked that. What about those awful Beatles? You know, so we said we pretended not to know anything about it.
There was a headline in a newspaper which I think said Zombies say Beatles are louts and hooligans for attacking our First Lady.
That was the Filipinos, it must have been, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yes,
I don't imagine.
well, it was President Marcos, and you say
Yeah.
it wasn't really democracy at all.
Because they refused to meet the Imelda Marcos, didn't they?
No, it wasn't. They refused. They didn't even know about it.
Did they? Okay, right, okay.
Yeah,
I thought they'd refused. I
no,
must
they
have
hadn't refused.
misremembered
They
that.
didn't know about it.
Blimey. And what would the conversations between you be? Because obviously you only had each other, in this very alien situation.
It's quite interesting because the shows were, 30 or 40,000 people a night. That was unbelievable.
Well, those at that point, surely easily the biggest audiences you must have played.
Oh yes, yes, yeah.
And is it basically that how do you alter what you do playing to that, how is it different playing to that amount of people to playing, say, Watford Town Hall?
Well, the funny thing is when you first play Watford Town Hall, it feels enormous, but when you went back recently, it's tiny.
Yeah, I'm sure.
But your concept of it is engendered, it makes you feel that you're playing the biggest place, is the biggest place you ever played ever, But because subsequently we found out, I got a confession from one of the people who worked for Tito that he was getting £2,000 a night for us in exchange for two sets of contracts.
Okay. I mean, really, you've been sustained by that. You're that one bit of good luck you had where you actually signed a good deal.
Yes,
that's kind of made all the difference for you, hasn't it?
Yes, it's funny. It's difficult finding the good people who do it because they love the music. The people who just make a living. Because this fellow said to me, he said, "Well, why did he do that? Why did he?" said, "Well, if he said if we hadn't done it, someone else would do it."
Yeah, in a completely sanguine way, I would imagine.
Yes, yeah. That was business, music business,
Tom Petty in his, I think maybe on the line notes to Zombie Heaven, I think he said he first saw you in 1965. I think he said that you had a raccoon's tail hanging from your bass.
Actually, it was a tiger's tail, which it was an advert for one of the petrol companies at the time. I've still got it.
I'll put the tiger in your tank.
Yes, that's right.
Okay,
but I just hung it off my bass.
Oh, I see. Okay, so you do. Was that just a habitual fixture?
Some fan gave it to me, so I thought I'd just fix it on the end of the bass.
Okay, fair enough. I'd like to ask you about some of your particular. I mean, I guess you guys were all writing very quickly, so maybe you might not even remember the circumstances in which you wrote them. But it would be nice to try anyway, because I was going to start with a couple of early songs, like "I Can't Make My Mind Up," which is a particular favourite.
I Can't Make Up My Mind. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's funny, I can remember writing that one. I can't remember the circumstances, right, because I wrote on piano, because you can't write on the double bass or the bass. So
you were adept, even at that time keyboard. You were adept, were you?
I wasn't adept, I was capable of playing guitar, and my father played guitar as well.
Yeah.
I remember all the family gatherings where he used to play Frankie and Johnny all the time on his guitar. But anyway, writing that song, Colin complained. He said, because you're squeezing far too many words into the
really?
tempo, yes.
But did that make you think about, I guess that must have made you think about what works for a singer?
Well, Rod and I both say that our writing was geared totally to the quality of Colin's range and his ability, because you write for somebody.
Is it? I guess it must be easier to write with someone in mind than just to write recreationally, just because.
Yes.
And then there's I Don't Want to Know, which, again, is kind of quite ahead of its time in a way. It's got that lovely kind of birdsy sort of guitar going on.
Yes, the 12-string. We like that sound as well, yes.
Who did that 12-string belong to?
Paul Atkinson, the guitarist.
They must have been quite hard to come by at that point in time.
Well, no, there were a few going around. Dean Street and not Dean Street.
Denmark Street.
Denmark Street, yes.
Yeah. Can you remember much about the circumstances of sort of writing that one, or
no?
You just kind of have a spare minute, presumably, and you just kind of.
Well, with writing songs, it's either a phrase, a sequence, or a pattern which starts you off, and then it just develops really. And talking about
Denmark Street.
Denmark Street.
Yeah.
You did hear the other day that we got presented by the Buddy Holly Foundation with a replica guitar that was handmade for us, the Zombies, by Tim Rice and Mike Reed in Hank's guitar shop.
It's ironic, isn't it? Because Denmark Street is hanging on by the skin of its teeth.
It is, yeah.
And with the Soho redevelopment, you know,
Yes.
it's still unclear as to whether or not it will survive.
I know.
Which is
Part
kind
of
of crazy.
history, yeah.
Well, you know, we celebrate it on one hand, and then at the other hand, it's kind of at the moment, I think it's literally on one side, it's just a facade.
Yes.
There's nothing behind it.
Well, the Regent Street studio, Regent Sound is still there, I think.
Right, okay.
We did a lot of demos there for Rod and I, you know, years ago.
I mean, it sounds like it's very easy for someone like myself who wasn't there at the time to romanticize that little area of London, because it just seemed to be that's where all of pop music seemed to be happening. But I guess if you were living through it at the time, you probably didn't really stop to kind of question it.
Of course you did. Yeah, it was exciting because when we signed the contract, I had the contract, we went to get new drums, new bass guitars, because She's Not There was recorded on a handmade bass.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we had new equipment and Vox amplifiers. Which
it changed everything, didn't it? Like Rod buying an electric piano seemed to be like a
Yes.
massive step for you, didn't it?
Well, it was electric. It was a pianette. That was
Right.
the thing. And then he got onto the Vox Continental.
Were you trying to? I don't mean this in a sort of pernicious sense, but just in the same way that Lennon and McCartney were trying to outdo each other, and they kind of recognised that was good. That kind of positive rivalry was good for the band. Was there a sense of?
Oh
that
yes,
with
there
you?
was. In any writing partnership, though Rod and I didn't write joint songs at that point,
No, I know.
is basically you have to prove to the other person. You have to get acceptance. You have to work on things, and that rivalry can be constructive or destructive. Ours was constructive.
Was it what would constitute a good reaction from Rod? What were you looking for when you would play him a song?
That works. Yeah, let's try this.
Nothing more than that.
No,
really.
nothing more than that. We did it in rehearsal with the band, you see. So we worked on things well while we had the instruments with us.
And was it hard to? Obviously, you had that sort of chart success, which is not there, and then there was a succession of songs which, in this country, didn't chart. I trying to put myself in your position, I would start to sort of think that maybe I'd be a little bit nervous. I'd be a bit worried that I might have to get a kind of quote unquote proper job soon. Were any of these things considerations for you?
No.
Why not?
Because I love music so much, and it was exciting writing. And I was going to be an art teacher and an artist, basically. So when I started writing songs, I stopped painting.
Right. Okay.
Because they're similar disciplines. And so, and what happened really was our second single was a song I'd written. We were on tour with Tito's tour going around England. We came back overnight to record this, and we weren't happy with the recording because he made Colin's voice soft and gentle. When we played it on stage, it was much harder, and that was "Leave Me Be."
Right. Okay.
And we didn't like it, but it was put out as the next single. Those days, you didn't do albums first.
Yeah.
So, and then we were never allowed to be on the mixing sessions of our singles.
Presumably you asked to be?
Yes, we said no. You don't come in. Because that was the formula for the day, basically. Then, and then that's why Rod and I wanted to produce ourselves.
Right, yeah. Because you must have been gazing on at sort of, I guess the obvious example is the Beatles, who had this very symbiotic relationship with George Martin, who was very receptive to their sort of input. And that really...
And Brian Wilson as well, because creativity, which got the Beatles going and different things.
But that option, for a long time, that option didn't seem to be available to you.
No, and so when we came back from the Philippines, we had no manager. Decca had dropped us, and we wanted to, Rod and I, who were the writers, weren't hearing the songs as we heard them in our heads. But then our production, Ken Jones, said, well, yeah, okay, fine, we'll get you into Abbey Road. We were one of the first groups who weren't signed to EMI to go into Abbey Road.
And you Odessey and Oracle was recorded quite a while before it came out, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was in 67, yeah.
Well, weren't the Beatles recording Sgt Pepper at the same time?
No, they'd just finished. They were coming out as we went in. We were in Studio 3, they were mainly in Studio 2. But they had left the Mellotron there.
They had.
Which Rod went straight to and used on the... We were only recording on 4-track, don't forget.
Still, I know the Beatles. I guess if the
Beatles had invented this system, or got them to do 4-track, then a bounce to another 4-track onto 2 tracks. so that sort of thing.
Was that a system that you were familiar with? Did you have to, or are we
we
literally...
were using Jeff Emerick, so he'd done it.
Yeah, yeah.
So we use that. Rod remembers different, and as we get into our 70s, we remember things differently, as Colin would say. Yeah.
Well, of course, yeah. Didn't you also? Wasn't Gus Dudgeon was kind of abruptly promoted from tape op to engineer on She's Not There.
Our first session, that's right. We did, when we recorded in Decca in those days, you recorded night time.
Right.
We went in the evening. But the engineer, Ken Jones was producing, the engineer had unfortunately been at a wedding all day, was pissed out of his mind, and was abusive. And Colin, as always says, basically, I thought, if this is what recording is going to be like, I don't want to do it. But then he unfortunately collapsed in the control room.
Did you say he was abusive?
Yeah, so fucking get on with it, basically, sing what's this song called, get on with it, basically. And then he collapsed. And we had to carry him out, all of us, 4 of us, taking us up, put him in a cab. Never saw him from that day to this. The tape operator was Gus Dudgeon.
Was that his first? Was that his first de facto production?
Yes, his first engineering, because Ken Jones was the producer. But
yes,
and we were friends with him long after that.
Yes. That's incredible. Wow. And so moving back to Odyssey and Oracle, which was, so you had it was a blessing really to be on a different label at this point. And you must have had
we were on license deal, so we weren't signed to labels.
Right.
So then, CBS was starting off in England then. And they gave us £1,000 to do an album.
That seems like a lot for that time.
Well, not really, because Abbey Road wasn't cheap.
Right. Okay.
So what we had, we went there in 3-hour sessions we had to do. So we probably did 2 songs in a session.
Right.
But then we went in totally and utterly rehearsed. We rehearsed every single thing before we went in, because bass, guitar, and drums were put on one track, keyboards on another, lead vocal on the third, and then harmonies on the fourth.
It's interesting that, as you said, you couldn't have heard Sgt Pepper because the Beatles had only just finished work on it.
Yeah.
But what you were doing wasn't sort of dissimilar in many ways. There's a sort of thematic kind of unity to a lot of the record.
Yes.
And yet you and Rod were writing separately.
Yes.
That's kind of fascinating to me, how everything is so cohesive, and yet
we thought alike, and we all learnt together. We grew up together musically, being influenced by the Beatles and by Brian Wilson. Which another interesting thing is, this September we're doing 18 days in 3 weeks with Brian Wilson.
Oh my word!
We're doing Odyssey and Oracle, and he's doing 2 of his albums.
Oh wow!
I couldn't be more excited.
Have you actually? I met
Brian.
You must have met him, I guess.
Oh yes. It was very funny when Paul Atkinson was ill in, I think, 2004. We went over to Los Angeles to do at the House of Blues a concert because he owed $1 million in medical bills.
Yeah.
And Brian Wilson's band was there, and Hugh and I went in for the day for getting a sound check because we hadn't played with the others for many years. And the one of them came down and said, "Oh, it's Christian, you come up and meet Brian." So we went up the stage. The band bowed down to us, which was unexpected. And they had our album. Would you sign the album? This is we had no concept of being famous at all.
Well, you really had to. I mean, often you find this a lot. Certainly, with some musicians I've met over the years, where almost you're the last person to be told that. That an album that you kind of had written off or maybe thought was forgotten.
Well, nobody wanted the album over here. That's why we split up. And the other moment that happened to me was when we did Shepherd's Bush. Paul Weller came back every night, and I'd never met him. And sort of, I really liked what he was doing. So backstage, I shyly went, Paul, it's Chris White. I remember, he gave me a great big bear hug, and he said, "Chris White, you're the reason I started writing songs." Now, that from nothing, that was unbelievable.
Well, Paul is a fan. Paul is still to this day a collector and a fan. And,
oh yes, he's a lovely man, and he keeps doing music. He's trying to do everything, So
I saw him in the audience at that Bloomsbury show about 15 years ago or something. The one that was billed as the Zombies, but I don't think you played.
No,
it.
that was the Rod Collin and the Touring Band, which was good band.
Yeah. I just remember him in the foyer, just looking very excited about what was.
He's a lovely man. He's a musician. And Dave Grohl as well is another one surprised me.
Yeah, I heard that. That was a surprising one.
It was. He did. This Will Be Our Year on one of our albums, the record store release thing, Record Day.
Right.
And when we did the first American tour, we heard Foo Fighters were all coming. They didn't come backstage because we thought they didn't like it. But then on the last tour that Rod and Colin did, he came up to Rod and he said, I was too overcome. And his wife said, yes, he was crying 3 times during your gig. Rod said, basically, were we that bad?
Sometimes you don't go backstage because you're kind of imagining that the band is besieged and the last thing that they need is just someone else backstage. You know, usually if I don't go backstage, that's probably the reason. Well,
Rod doesn't like to know who's at the front of stage, actually, because he worries that he's going to perform badly, you know.
Right, okay, yeah. That kind of makes a certain amount of sense. And so you, this is your songwriting on Odessey and Oracle is, by any stretch of the imagination, pretty astounding. You must have felt pretty good, I would imagine, with your song tally going into those sessions.
Oh yes, I was. And I tell you, the best thing about Rod is he doesn't like mistakes on stage, right? So when he screws up some piano playing at the intro or something, we all look at each other and think, it's right. No, he's not going to give us that dirty look when we make a mistake. But the good thing about Rod is basically when the Zombies finished and he and I wanted to continue producing, Rod had all the 3 big hits.
Yeah.
And so he said to me, look, why don't we put our joint names on our songs? Because one hit will make all the difference. And that was incredibly generous of him.
It is incredible.
The next song was a big hit, was Hold Your Head Up, which I wrote.
Yeah.
Never regretted it at all because that was really wonderful thing that he did, you know.
That's absolutely, and it's a very wise thing to do as well, because in terms of sustaining, enriching your long-term creative relationship, it kind of it liberates you, I think, in a way. I think it's very clever. I'm interested in this thing about the subconscious adjustments you make when you know that you're writing for a particular voice, and I think about this persona that Colin projects through his singing, which may or may not be true. I don't really know Colin, so I can't gauge it. But then I think about a song like, Maybe After He's Gone, and it's such a touching sentiment that maybe, maybe after this has run its course, I'm still here.
Yeah, I'm second rate, but I'm still here.
Yeah, and
that was me writing. I'm not saying Collins.
No, but it's kind of was that kind of. I guess I'm wondering if that's a song that you would have written at all had you not envisaged that Colin would sing it.
It's difficult to say because I wrote for Colin's voice, and he has such a wonderful voice and very English. It's a lot of singers around that time had American accents because rock and roll was American, but he sang with an English voice.
It's the only other song I can think of that kind of thematically deals with that, projects, has the same kind of message, is "Take a Chance on Me" by ABBA.
Oh,
which
yes.
Again is sort of after.
Yes.
I'll be here.
Yes.
Where all that's kind of.
Yeah, a bit like the winner takes it all,
Yeah. But no, it's amazing. That was a very emotional night. The Shepherd's Bush night. I think I really felt there was a charge that night and I think it's absolutely something to do with the fact that we know that there is a sense that everyone in that room, everyone who still has a relationship with a record like that, can play a small part in restoring this. Well, it's happened now already,
yes.
But restoring this record to its sort of rightful place, and you want to be kind of a part of that. But it must be kind of crazy to be getting on with your lives and then to be suddenly kind of get the memo that actually this is a far more important record than maybe
Well, it felt like we did our best at the time. We thought it was the best thing we could do at the time. Then to have the justification 50 years later which is wonderful, especially if you're old enough not to be swayed by it. And of course, the other interesting factor is when we got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that day, to the day, 50 years earlier, Time of the Season was the first time I went to #1 in Cashbox in America, to that day.
Wow.
50 years, exactly.
That's a song that even my kids now, my youngest daughter, when she was 13, she just discovered it somewhere, and I could hear it playing from her room. It is just a song that completely transcends the generations and continues to do so. Is it true that with the sleeve of that record, is that? I read somewhere that you decided to just run with the misspelt title because you didn't want to upset the designer, Terry Quirk.
Terry Quirk, I was at art school with him, basically, and I was sharing a flat with him and Rod. And when we were doing Odessey and Oracle, he got this idea, we said, Rod came up with the idea of Odessey and Oracle because the songs were about actions and stories. And we were busy, and he said, look, showed us, and in all the swirly writing, we didn't notice that he'd spelt it wrong.
Right.
And we only noticed when they showed us the cover to be produced. And we said, oh, no, you've got to change that. It's too late. It's in production. So Rod came up with the story that basically it was a cross between an ode and an Odyssey. Right? And we stuck to this, but we didn't tell Colin. And it was only a few years back I saw an interview with Rod and Colin, and Rod was telling that story, and Colin turned around and said, you didn't tell me that. It was about 40 years later we found out.
Colin has got, last time I interviewed you, Colin, it was all of you together. And Colin has it, it seems to be very Colin. Colin seems to be sort of has a perpetual air of surprise about, I think there were about 3 things that came up in the interview that he also didn't know.
Yes, it's true.
It's very sweet. He also kind of another quote from him I loved, which actually gave me an idea for a documentary, which I went on to do for Radio 4. Was he said, I saw far more musicians eating greasy breakfasts at the M1 Blue Ball services than I ever saw popping pills.
Absolutely. Well, we didn't take any drugs. I mean, not trying to be clean or anything. The only person who smoked in the band was the drummer. That's cigarettes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I only just started smoking when I was 40.
Really? Why?
Yeah. I'll tell you later. I was living in Spain at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Was it something to do with divorce or something like that?
No, it was just that they were very cheap at 25p a packet of Ducados,
God, that's hilarious. How soon afterwards did you give up again?
Well, I gave up about 8 years ago and started 2 years later, and I'm now smoking a third of a cigarette when I throw it away. Ridiculous.
It must have been startling when you kind of hooked up with your old friends in the band, and they said, "You're smoking?"
No, I go outside and do it now.
Okay.
So I don't like it. It's ridiculous. It's writing things. Sometimes you used to have a cigarette going on when you're writing.
Of course.
And burning out in ashtrays.
So obviously, famously. The Zombies no longer existed by the time of the Season topped the charts in America.
Right.
How long did it take you to kind of learn that there were pretend versions of the Zombies kind of going around?
Well, a few years later, actually.
Oh, quite a few years later.
Yeah. We got knowledge of it, and then Paul Atkinson was sent a tape for a radio interview. Had been to see a fake band, and there was somebody in the band called Hugh Grundy, who played bass. You see. And then the interviewer knew that they were fake and basically led him up. They said, well, why have you given up drums and playing bass? He said, well, the boys want me to be at the front,
What, in an American accent?
Well, it was a Northern English accent. And he said, and didn't you used to be 5'10"? Because his bloke was tiny. And then he owned up. He said it wasn't him, so it wasn't really. And,
one or two members of ZZ Top.
Yes, yeah. And we found Rod boasts now that basically when we split up, we're going to go out as a fake ZZ Top band.
staple on the beards,
Yes,
and away you go. And then, of course, there's this kind of strange episode. I'm kind of fascinated by this little period in your history because obviously you kind of went on to, you've stayed in music, obviously, in Argent, and obviously you worked on Collins' two solo albums in the
Three solo albums we did.
All right, or three, okay, excuse me. And there's also this, I'm fascinated by this strange period where Colin changed his name to Neil MacArthur.
That his father said you can't hang around the house, you've got to get a job. So he went into an insurance company, and then She's Not There Time of the Season happened, and then Mike Hurst said, why don't we record some things? We'll do a new version of She's Not There. But he couldn't. He had tried to join Equity, but there was already somebody called Colin Blunstone. So he had to be called Neil MacArthur, just picked out of the hat, really, basically.
Yeah. But it must have been very confusing, because he did it on Top of the Pops, didn't he?
Yes. Yeah.
It must have been very bewildering for, people to turn on the television and see someone who was manifestly Colin Blunstone calling himself Neil MacArthur doing a song that he had made famous.
Yes.
As Colin Blunstone.
Yes. It was weird.
But it seems to say a lot about his obliging nature.
When he got back in the studios again, doing evening sessions, and then that paled for him, and then I took him along to rehearsals with Rod and I were doing with Argent.
Yeah.
And he got very excited. And I said, well, we've got a deal with CBS in New York. Why don't we do an album with you? And that was exciting. His first album, 1 year.
Which, again, I think, people, and Ennismore as well, which people have a lot of affection for.
Yeah.
Which you co-produced.
Yeah, yes. We got Chris Gunning in to do these great string arrangements. He's a great arranger, Chris Gunning.
And was that a kind of more agreeable sort of arrangement for you? Had you decided by that point that the touring life was not for you?
Well, no. When Rod put the group together, he wanted to be more progressive. And his cousin, Jim Rodford, who sadly died a year ago, when he first put the Zombies, helped put this equipment up for the Zombies when they first got together before I was involved, because he had a local band called the Blue Tones, not the later thing. And then he's a far better bass player than me. I'm really a songwriter who plays bass. But Jim was a great bass player, and he'd been for Kinks for 12 years as well. And he got together with Rod and put Argent together, and they were great sounding. So I didn't want to compete with such a good bass player,
Okay. But you did. But you didn't have any. Did you still have that kind of that urge to be taught, or were you presumably you were kind of had kids at that point? You maybe
yes,
it wasn't necessarily.
But it was a bit like when I left art college. The minute I started writing songs, I didn't paint, and then the minute I started touring, I was producing. I didn't play the bass. I still had a bass.
Yeah, yeah. And had the arrangement that you have now, where sometimes you seem to be in the Zombies, and sometimes you don't.
Hugh and I, there's Rod, Colin, Hugh and I. We only do Odessey and Oracle, simple as that, from beginning to end as it was recorded, which goes down so well.
Yeah.
And of course, we've got Darren Sahanaja, who on this next tour is going to be playing for Brian Wilson and us as well. He
seems to be living his best life, just basically playing with his heroes on his favourite records.
Yeah. And he's the only person who can tell Rod when he goes wrong.
Why?
Well, because he's very quiet, Darian. And when we did the first rehearsals for Odyssey and Oracle, the Shepherd's Bush thing, he came up during one of the breaks and said, Rod, in so-and-so, you didn't play that, you played something else, you see. Rod said, no, I didn't. And then he said, look, you did this. Rod said, oh, yeah. I did. So even on stage now, he says the only person who can tell him where he's going wrong, because he did the same thing for Brian Wilson as well. You see, he did all the stuff. He's great. Darren's fantastic player.
He's universally loved, I think.
Yes, he is a wonderful man.
So we were talking earlier on about, is it your son that's unearthed a cache of unreleased songs by you recorded over the decades?
Yeah, two of my sons, Matthew and Jamie. I discovered, I realised I had to get rid of them. They were in my mother-in-law's attic for 23 years. And so she kept asking us to do something about them. And they discovered 50 boxes of tapes and cassettes and hard drives. And and basically I said I'd like to put some of those songs, and some of the nice ones I'd like to put them on YouTube or something.
Yeah.
And so they discovered at least, I think, nearly 200 songs, 180 of which were never released, which I'd written with Matthew Fisher and
Procol Harum.
Yes, yeah, and several other writers, and we went in studios and recorded them over since the 70s.
Wow.
So they said we'd like to put them out, so they were going to put out 8 CDs. One of them's out, well, not as a CD, as a promotional CD of 13 tracks that I'd recorded over those years.
Wow.
And they're well geared for it because Matthew, my eldest son, did train as an engineer at Abbey Road, front row, and then in the company which downloads for Spotify all the stuff on that drive. And the other son has his own band and was touring with the Zombies in America for a few years back.
Wow,
as an opener. And so they're going to start it as a business. So they're working here with Ace, with Nick as well.
That's incredible. And how there must have been songs that you'd forgotten that you'd written.
Absolutely. In fact, I had to remember them. And I said, well, that was quite good. Did I write that? And then they said, yes, you did. You wrote that. It's your name's on it and so and so. So it's been quite a journey, really, basically, listening to some of these songs I wrote 50 years ago.
And listening to them as you would listen to a song by someone who you'd never heard before.
Because Colin's singing on them, and was it Steve Gold from Rare Birds sang some of them with them, and Maggie Ryder, and some fantastic singers just doing session work,
So you just kind of as a matter of course, you get someone like Colin over just to say,
yes, yeah,
that's lovely.
Yeah.
Okay. And you still see, and outside of the ongoing Odessey and Oracle sort of touring, which is coming up, do you still have occasion? I guess you have occasion to see the band from time to time.
Quite a bit. In fact, recently the American managers got married at Rod's house a few weeks back, and we all were there. Rod and Colin gave her away, and it was a fantastic occasion. We had all the Zombies there, and the manager calls our children the zombie spawn, so they were there as well, my sons and Hugh's daughters and everything. So it was quite an interesting occasion.
What went right? Well, what is it about this specific combination of people that makes it still so pleasant to be around them, whereas other bands, you see it all the time. You mentioned it earlier on. You see kind of recriminations, unresolved rivalries, petty sort of disputes that percolate through the years. You seem to have avoided all of those.
Well, there have been occasions when we had arguments together, but we grew up musically together. We learned our trade together, and that sticks with you.
Yeah.
And after 54 years or whatever it is, we still like each other. We've had our disagreements, we don't talk about certain things, but mostly we understand each other's manner. And funny enough, when we came back from New York, Hugh Grundy, who lives in Menorca, his wife, his friends there couldn't make it to New York, so she set up something to celebrate the induction and asked us to come over, and not telling Hugh, he didn't know. So myself and my wife, who is on stage with us singing when we do Odessey and Oracle, and Terry Quirk and his wife, we went over there. It was a bit like being witness protection, because her friends kept hiding us in this little island until he finally had his band that he works with there at a pub.
Yeah.
And we were arranging then T-shirts and everything, and he came in. She was trying to keep him away from us, and he walked in and he suddenly saw us. Then I can't use the expletive he used, but it was quite in a moment,
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
What was it that I meant to ask earlier? What was it that Susanna Hoff said? It's amazing to have that intro from Susanna Hoff.
Oh, she was wonderful. She said as a young kid in the back of her mum's car hearing the Zombies, and she was just talking about the songs, and she was quite emotional about it.
Yeah, of course.
And she was really wonderful about it, and because we remember from the Bangles and everything, And she was just absolutely, she's lovely. She looks so young. She's in her 60s now. She was 60.
Oh my word!
And she looks stunning now, and she's such a lovely lady.
Well, that was what the Bangles, from their very inception, they were a band that was sort of defined by the records they loved.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of pretty much how they operate now.
And she came along to some of our gigs in LA and to sing with us during rehearsals. She did This Will Be Our Year with Colin. and I was playing behind her. That was a fantastic feeling.
I imagine how she must have felt,
Yes.
these songs that you grow up with,
Yes.
and you invest so much in. And we still continue to do that, which is why it's such a pleasure to have spent some time with you today.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Chris White from The Zombies and, of course, from Argent. Thank you very much for joining me in the ACE podcast. For more excellent music, you can scoot over to the Ace Records website, www.acerecords.co.uk. All the wonderful music you could possibly need.